Now we're going to begin the question and answer, and of course, I'd like to invite back on stage our chairperson, Professor De Meyer. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, the floor is now open for the question and answer session. Please use the microphones available at the aisles, and also you may raise your hand, and we will pass the microphone to you. So now we'll hand the time over to Professor Breznitz and Professor De Meyer.
I will open the question and answer session, and as usual, it's probably very good that when you ask the question that you also say who you are and where you come from or whom you represent. But I will take the advantage of being the chair of the session to ask my question. I told you earlier on that I invited Dan Breznitz because I had a number of questions. But one of the questions that I sort of finished with, and from the perspective of somebody who's interested in innovation, is whether this structured uncertainty that you're talking about leads to a particular type of innovation. I mean, the sort of the common sense that I have is that if I have to work with structured uncertainty, that I will actually apply short-term thinking, that I will not think in long-term, and that it does the type of innovations that I will invest in are the ones that are cheap, quick and dirty, and that I don't build up the capabilities at the same time to do this long-term investment. And yet, I have to admit that when I look at companies like Huawei, that they really have dominated the world market in almost any product in the telecommunication equipment industry, which I happen to know quite well. They're in the top 3. So they did. I've had this sort of contrast, or this sort of this problem that I, on the one hand, see that this structured uncertainty should lead to short-term thinking. On the other hand, there are industries where China is actually quite important, and industries that require long-term investment. Can you sort of?
Sure. So first, yes, and thank you for mentioning structured uncertainty. So one of the things that happen when you have structured uncertainty, especially when so many of the enterprises in China are not fully private, what you know is how you'll be judged. And if you create growth, which is basically revenues and jobs, you know that you'll be judged as successful. And if not, so you have a lot of incentives to ensure those and ensure them in the short term, and also make sure that you don't fail too much, because failing is bad for your career investment, which leads indeed to a lot of those short-term innovation, which then also leads to the creation of different strategies and plays. So if you think about Huawei, which, by the way, and to a certain degree ZTE, are unique, okay? But just, there is very little, if any, companies that even resemble Huawei and ZTE. And even between Huawei and ZTE, I'm not sure ZTE can even really compete with Huawei. But if you look at how Huawei started, it started on manufacturing of really simple products, selling them to the rural area, building them up. To a certain degree, if you believe Cisco, acquiring intellectual property from other places. And only then, and it grew and had the stability of huge revenues, start to do more and more and more of R&D. Partly, I think, also as a reaction to prevent it from being attacked the way Cisco attacked it. But even today, so if you go to Europe, you have dongles, which in the US for some reasons are not highly, but all those mobile internet that you stick to your laptop and you can have wireless, internet connections from anywhere. All of them are Huawei, and Huawei leads the market. But Huawei did not invent dongle. And as a matter of fact, if you go to any product line, I will challenge you to find a product that Huawei really invented. And that's one, I think, way in which Huawei deal with this structured uncertainty. They always wait to see where the new products come from, they already have the capabilities to play in it very fast and even control the market. But they are not yet into creating the new market, and partly that's the legacy of how they grew up.
Yep. Yep. Let me open it for questions from the floor. Anybody who wants to? Yeah, in the back there. Somebody can probably bring you the microphone.
Okay, Dan. My name is Andreas. I'm from Hay Group. My question is also related to your structural uncertainty. If China government is actually on purpose to create a structural uncertainty, it's my understanding from your presentation is must be some game plan that ensure that structural uncertainty lead to some kind of innovation. So my question is that true? And is that true? Is what kind of game plan that actually able to control structural uncertainty in this different cluster of innovation? Thank you.
So I would say that structural uncertainty is also actually the unintended consequences of a Chinese system. So let's very briefly talk about what structured uncertainty is. So if we believe in institutional theory, and especially about innovation, one of the things that will create more innovation is if you have more certainty. So standards are supposed to create, patents are supposed to create more incentives and certainty. You have structured uncertainty anywhere. So for example, you walk down in the street of New York and, and you don't stop in a red light and a police officer stops you. He or she actually have a lot of a leeway in what to do with you now, right? And it depends, you know, you have unbelievable amount of Hollywood movies about this exact moment and how the policeman will act, whether you're, you know, if you look at Hollywood, you're a beautiful blonde or you're a man, all depends on what the policeman will do, right? And this is structured uncertainty because all of those pathways are completely fine and legal. You don't know which one will happen. Now move it into China, within the Chinese legal system, the idea of a communist country, interesting financial system. You really don't know which, and even if you're a local official, you really don't know which action is the correct and will be the fully acceptable action to take. And it actually might be that 6 of them will be as acceptable at the same time. We are being taught that in order to create innovation, and especially long-term innovation, you want to diminish this. In China, as part of how a communist country moved into become more and more capitalism with Chinese characters, this is just the reality on the ground. And that influences what companies do, what individuals, entrepreneurs do, and also what local officials do. I'm not sure that this is what the central government wanted to happen, but this is just the reality of what is happening. And why a game plan, which is basically the run of a Red Queen, makes so much more sense, because you lower the risk of uncertainty. You wait until somebody proves that there is a product or there is a market, and only then you move into it. You don't do something which is both long-term and high risk and have a high probability of failure. And part of the reason is because you already have so much uncertainty that you try to limit it in any other way.
I guess that I just want to reinforce a point that Dan just made, and which was one of the intriguing parts for me of what he observed about China, is that we as scholars of management of innovation, or economists that are working on innovation, will always talk about de-risking. The role of the government is about de-risking the environment. It's exactly what the Singapore government does, trying to reduce the risk for the entrepreneurs. And what comes out of the book is that China's innovation is successful because it increased the risk for the entrepreneurs. It's a bit black and white that I put it that way, but it is an interesting point to reflect upon when you look at it from a Singapore point of view. Is there any other question? Yes. You can either take the mic, yeah, just walk up.
Yeah, if I come out. Raymond Kwok from Oxford Economic and VC. Then, a word in China called sanjai, which is basically copy it right, basically try to copy. Do you think that that particular model, which is China innovation model, in order to be outpaced, whenever somebody have got invented something, we innovate by providing a better, quicker way of going to market, will sustain China?
To the medium and short term, and to some degree the long term, yes. Also because China, what is different about China and the other countries that are being developed is that China is a huge market by itself, which then allow you to actually take all those innovations and fit them into the local market of 1.3 billion people, which if you were Korea and Japan, there's only limits. This is now not only a huge market, but one of the only one that still grow and becoming more and more important. And it's a market which is completely underserved in terms of innovation. I mean, American companies don't really think about the Chinese consumer when they come up with real innovation. So there's a lot of opening place there.
Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Clemens Betzel. I work with JCB Associates based here in Singapore. My interest is in renewables, solar energy and wind energy, and one could add that to the long good list that you gave from the ICT industry. In solar, you had 10 big companies 10 years ago. They were all European and American. Today, 5 of them are Chinese. And that shows that they have perfected the methods of manufacturing. But again, you have no real innovation of new technologies in this field, which leads to a backlash in especially the West, where people say, we need to stop that. It is unfair. They price the products differently. What you're telling us now is that innovation is on the rise in China. Is the backlash in the West coming too late, and will it have adverse effects on the China-Western relationship in terms of commerce and trade? Because we will retaliate maybe 5 years too late when they have become innovators that are keen on protecting their own copyrights and patents themselves.
So I would say that China, if you believe that IPR protection is really important, which to a certain degree it is, even through the American patent system, leaves a lot to be asked for, especially as I think now people know the court case in India, which might completely change the way AIDS drugs are accessed by poor people around the world. What I say is that China is changing partly because companies like Huawei or ZTE or others, now that they have their own innovation, wants to protect it. Which, by the way, shouldn't surprise us because, you know, America stole all the innovation of England, supposedly illegally, until America, we had our own innovation, so we created a system to defend them. Japan has done the same, and then Korea and Taiwan have done the same, and as soon as their companies have something to protect, they demanded a change of a rule. So I assume that the same kind of dynamic would happen in China. In terms of a backlash, I highly suspect that there will be more and more backlash, especially now when you have a financial crisis, not everybody is growing. And it will probably hurt everybody because we have an integrated global system of production and trade. Whether it will have huge influence and impact on how China reacts, which is bigger than the internal dynamics, I suspect not that much. I mean, it happens in the past, for example, Cisco and Huawei, and the end result was that Cisco dropped the lawsuit and changed its way. But also Huawei just grew up and changed its behavior, not necessarily because of this lawsuit.
Yeah. The microphone will come to you.
My name is Charles Chow from the East West Group. Question. The concept of China, and you mentioned about this structured uncertainty. How big is the role of the Chinese diaspora in spearheading, in sponsoring, especially from the finance, and in direction of innovations for the develops in China?
So, this is interesting. I have a research with Martin Kenny of UC Davis about the role of diaspora. What is interesting in the case of China versus Taiwan, for example, or India, is because China was a closed economy, and basically no one was allowed out. When China started to develop, there actually was no returnees to return to China, right? You just started, the students started only basically in the early 80s. So you had a whole development where returnees were actually not that important, comparatively speaking, versus Taiwan and India. It is starting to change, but by now the returnees that come back to China are already working within a system which is very well developed and set in its own trajectory. So a lot of the more innovative new companies have been started by returnees. It's also important because whether it's right or not, it's just a fact. The Chinese government and local governments spend a lot of money on bringing, the sea turtles back and give them various leeways that they just don't give local entrepreneurs, which of course will have consequences on the development. I'm not sure for better or worse, but just that's what they do. In terms of finance, let us remember, we now constantly complain about how China behaves to foreign finance and multinationals. China has been more open to foreign direct investment and multinationals doing whatever they want in China than any other case of emerging economy. Try to do something now as a multinational corporation in Japan. I wish you luck, but I will not invest in your shares.
Yeah. Any other question? Yeah, in the middle there. Maybe we can bring the microphone.
I'm sorry, my name is Gianluca. I'm a student from Bocconi University in Italy. And usually in Italy we say that one of the reasons why the mafia spread a lot in the last 20 years was because they were able to make all their business without having a front line or front headline in newspapers. And every time they kill someone, of course, there was a front headline in newspaper. So my impression is that the innovation you described about China are exactly the same. They're really small innovations which the ordinary consumer does not notice, because as a consumer don't notice whether the camera is made in China, whether the small improvement comes from China, from a corporation in US. So my question would be, how long do you think it will take for normal consumer to see China competing against Silicon Valley or big innovation centers in US? I'm thinking about the project by the Chinese government to launch an airplane made in China. It seems to be a 100-seat airplane should be released by 2018, and they're thinking about competing against Airbus or Boeing by 2025 probably. So how do you think would be possible in the future, such a big changes, and if at a certain point, which will be the position between China and Silicon Valley?
So first, let's just straighten things up, okay? So airplanes, which might necessitate a lot of innovation, are not a novel product. We have been having airplanes for many, many years. We more or less know what an airplane should do and how it looked like. That's very different from the mythical Silicon Valley, which is to come up with a completely new product or technology that we can't even imagine what it would be. Okay, so the most famous now that has been celebrated is the PC revolution. Okay, or the transistor, or the integrated chips. It's not trying to innovate and create a product within your own country, but a product that is already well developed elsewhere. So those are two different things. And I would presume that just like the Chinese are now competing very well in automotive, that they will probably compete very well with airplanes. And the fact that China is growing means that already if you go down any street in the US and ask people what does China do, they will tell you that they compete with us and it's a zero-sum game. However, if you actually follow up how products are made and by whom, you quickly understand that those innovations of Silicon Valley wouldn't be happening and being transformed into products in prices we can actually afford without China. Which means that there's actually a division of labor, which, whether we like it or not, it's a division of labor that has happened, where the US, and I'll call it we now, go for novel product innovation, huge financial gains. If you look at the profits, for example, from, iPod, iPhone, or even the, HP laptops, most of the profits still go to the US already. But China get a lot of the jobs, if not most of the jobs. And this is a division of labor that had worked very well until now. The thing that has started to change is that China has become so big. But China, let us not forget, depends which statistic you believe, have either 300 million or up to 600 million people in abject poverty, meaning they have some difficulties to make sure that they have food every day, which, let's go to the lower end, it's still more people than the combined US population. So China might as well concentrate on things that are slightly different than what the US cares about, or Italy or Europe.
Any other question? Yeah. You'll have to give the microphone back. Can't take it to Italy.
Thank you. Hello?
Yeah.
Okay. My name is Clive. Currently, I'm a student from SMU. My question is, do you think China is really competing with the counterparts in terms of the global technology? Because, in my opinion, for example, Huawei, actually a really high proportion of the cost actually goes to the patents, patented by other countries. So because China doesn't have the cutting edge innovation, so it ended up paying a lot of money to the foreign countries instead of saving all the cost by itself. So yeah, back to my question, do you think China is really competing with Silicon Valley in terms of the global technology?
No, I think it's complementary. So what many people forget about Huawei is actually that Huawei also, until very recently, I haven't checked it in the last year, but almost all of the routers that you buy that were supposed to be Motorola routers or Huawei routers with, the M stick on them. And when I asked the head researcher in China, he said, we no longer compete with Huawei on current generation. They're better than us. In current generation, we just allow them to use our brand and buy their products. But this is a complementary system on a good day. Okay, you always have competition. Come on, we are a business, and business compete for profits, and you want to have competitions because of competition, business try to outpace pace each other and we have innovations. And as a consumer, supposedly, we all enjoy it. In terms of actually what happened in China, China does not compete directly with Silicon Valley. China probably unable the current evolution of Silicon Valley to happen, which is an evolution in which Silicon Valley really focus more and more on coming up with new ideas and have very little clue about how, I said very little, which is not completely correct, clue of how to make them happen, especially in production technologies that are already well developed. So Silicon Valley still innovate in extremely high production technology. So integrated optoelectronics, is still done only in the US. Discrete is already done almost only, actually, only in China. And this is a division of labor that had made, up until now, both sides richer. And the US especially enjoyed it because otherwise they would have lost to the Korean and the Japanese even more than they have been losing to them. But the question now is how can you manage a system in which the balance of power is changing? And it's not, and this was still okay in a world in which everybody grew and thought they were getting richer by the day. It's becoming much more acute now when the perception is that the US and Europe is, Japan even worse, suffering, and China is growing. And I'm not sure we have a good solution for it. But I don't think China and Silicon Valley are competing with one another. I think they actually allow each one to maximize what they're much better at.
Follow up on this question, you were mentioning that China has to pay, or Chinese companies have to pay a lot for patents which are owned by organizations in other countries. As we discussed earlier on in a private discussion, standards are also very important in determining innovation. Standards are currently set by the United States for United States markets, or by Germany, or by Europe for European markets. And China has tried a few times to set its own standards, but has failed. I will not use the word miserably because that's probably not the right word, but they have failed basically to set their own standards. How do you see that evolution? How do you see the role of Chinese companies, Chinese regulatory organizations in standard setting for the world?
So first of all, China has probably become the biggest player in the standard bodies, so which are international bodies like ITU or ISO. And they have been learning very fast how to play the game. So you could call it failing, but it's also the price of learning. And the second is, what do you mean by failing? So yes, the standard failed, but exactly on this question, if you look at the royalties that the Chinese manufacturer had to pay, they considerably change. So as soon as the Chinese government and officials started to develop, for example, a standard which will compete with Blu-ray, the royalties that only Chinese manufacturer, not Malaysian manufacturer, just Chinese manufacturer, had to pay the consortium for its use of patent, was cut by more than half. So on the one side, it might be a failure because the standard didn't succeed. On the other side, what is really important to Chinese companies, it's the royalties that they pay, which is a huge cost, especially as unit prices goes down. The standard game that China has been playing has been won successfully and very impressively.
So it may be a failure on one side, but a big success on the other side. Yeah. I see two questions in.
My name is Oscar Lee from ARL Asia, my own small IT company. I travel quite a bit for business, and I've seen China, I've seen India, and I remember something you said about India. Do you actually have similar research about, you know, India, why can't it be the factory of the world just like China in a few years' time, or why didn't it become a factory of China in the last few years? Because it still puzzles me, you know, it's a country with lots of people and probably much lower cost of living than China. What's missing there, you know?
So I'm not an Indian expert. So the real story behind this book, it was supposed to be a case study about how innovation transformed to economic growth in different places in the system. In China was supposed to be one case, in India is another, you know, very ambitious, probably too ambitious, but then I got sucked into China and the rest. So, but in terms of India, I would say that this is also because a lot of it is politics and the system itself about the way that productions have happened. On the other part of it, also because of the very different legal structure, Western companies have been only too willing to move not just, you know, software development, but also all the back office services to India, which back office services actually means that your core knowledge of what's happening in your company, including all financial transactions, but they're unwilling to do it to China. So there's different advantages to each system.
There is some other research that suggests that because the Chinese government is good in screaming off taxes, relatively speaking, to India, that they can invest in large R&D projects, and that you see a lot of innovation in infrastructure coming out of China. While the Indian government is completely incompetent in raising taxes, so all the proceeds of the economic growth actually stay with the population and does become spending power for the consumer. And for that reason, there are a number of people who assume that India actually could, in the coming years, become a very hotbed of ideas about consumer innovation, consumer-driven innovation, because the spending power is there to make consumer preferences. I just injected in the debate, I'm not a specialist either, but it's probably two very different evolutions because of the economic and political structure of the two countries. I had another question over there.
Hello, I'm a student here at SMU of management. My question is regarding your claim that China is at the cutting edge of technology and that, you know, it's not pushing frontiers. Not as much on the claim as it is on the reason for the claim. I'd been to this talk by the gentleman in India about a paper that he wrote in 2002, where he seemed to believe that this Chinese system of innovation, the reason for that system was to squeeze out the last ounce of, you know, hard work or innovation or ability to ideate that that a human had, you know, the social system of arbitrary detentions or child labor. Or he took a social science perspective and said that this system would work only as long as, you know, China would continue to develop, only as long as there was something better than China. Once it went on to become the best, the system would fail. What is your take on that?
Well, I would say that this is much more of a concern to countries like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and to a certain degree Singapore. China is far from being there. China is not playing this game yet of full catch-up. It still have, as I said, more people in abject poverty than the complete population of the US. But yes, a very, very interesting question, which is part of my other side of my research, since my first research was on places like Taiwan and Israel, is what do you do once you succeed? Right? So it's one thing that the government should do when there's nothing around and you have to create the first companies and the first research institution. It's a completely different thing when the industry is actually more developed than the government in terms of what they do and how they do R&D. Some countries seem to have managed it very well. Some other countries, Japan is sort of a classic example, have managed to stagnate very well for the last 25 years. In terms of China, I would say that they have at least 15 more years before they really face this. You know, the amount of poor people and growth they can still have is just unbelievable.
A last question there, yeah. And then I have a personal question.
Hi, I'm Kelly from Jabil Circuit. So it's my understanding that innovation in China has been largely related to the export sector. I'm curious if you think the nature of innovation will change going forward, so when the domestic market comes of age and when we find that the domestic market has an appetite rivaling or near that of the export market, whether you think it's still going to be a slow incremental change or whether it will be of a different nature.
So I would actually say that a lot of interesting innovation is already happening for the domestic market. So everybody here probably heard about Baidu, the search engine. So if you look, yeah, it looks like Google. The business model is like Google. But actually thinking about search in Mandarin, an effective search in Mandarin, an effective search in the way that the Chinese use the internet very differently, this is not, you know, simple copycatting technology. And the same way is also for Tencent. How do you make money from the internet in China? And their very innovative and pioneer use of avatar. You make money by that, you know. We now do it everywhere, but they were one of the first. You buy things for your online persona, and you're very willing to spend money on that. To what's called the pirate phones, which, you know, it's basically, all of this is based on chipset by MediaTek, which is a Taiwanese company. But you have unbelievable huge of innovation that fits the Chinese consumer. So it's a phone. Most of those phones would last for 3 to 6 months. Nobody expects them to last more. But they do a lot of things that are really important for Chinese. For example, some of them can fit 3 SIM cards at the same time, which Americans wouldn't understand why, but if you ever worked in China, you would know why. And they also, some of them would light you cigarettes for you, which again, the Americans. And indeed, one of my research projects now is to understand how this kind of innovation transforms the Chinese industry and whether they can then go back to the export, right? So whether those new innovations actually would allow Chinese companies to compete on global markets in ways that the Americans or the Western companies just yet couldn't figure out. And I think we'll know the answer within 4 to 5 years.
I have a last question. Why were you inspired by Through the Looking Glass of Lewis Carroll?
Well,
why is an academic who is an economist and combines that with institutional theory and a bit of sociology and in the management of innovation, suddenly goes back to a novel from the 20th century or earlier?
So first of all, because it's a great novel. But it started because of a Red Queen itself, both the run and the red. But then I went back to the book, and I found that it has it's unbelievable book about innovation. So one of the characters that I truly love is a white knight. So the last character before Alice becomes a queen herself. She meets a white knight which goes around and is completely covered with novel innovation that he invented himself, which are utterly useless, right?
Are you describing an academic?
No. I describe some of my best friends, but yes. So it's, I think, an extremely shrewd book about humans and human behavior. And I think innovation, with all due respect to the science and engineering, once you talk about innovation, you talk about social interaction, society, human beings, and how they use stuff, and how you create stuff, not just invent the stuff, create stuff that human beings want to use, and somehow also make a profit. Once you do that, you know, the economics, especially formal economics, is a very crude guide, but a novel from Victorian England proved to be a very good guide.
As a chairman, I have the privilege of sharing with you, indoctrinating what I learned from this, right? But I think this idea of institutional uncertainty is an important idea. And it's so counterintuitive to what we see here in Singapore, where, in line with what I personally think, the government, when it comes to innovation, tries to de-risk, as we said earlier, and make it easier to innovate. And while we see that perhaps at the center of mainland China, we see the same intentions, but where at provincial levels, there's a lot more uncertainty and very creative reactions to that uncertainty. And as you pointed out, that strength and resilience that comes for China out of that, the differences in systems. And you looked at 3 systems. I'm quite convinced there are probably even more than 3 systems, and that in other provinces and in other cities we even have different ways of reacting to that institutional uncertainty. The second point that I do think is important for us here is that interdependency that you're referring to, and how it is not anymore a product that is designed in Silicon Valley and sold in Silicon Valley, and at some moment in time then will be sold somewhere else, but that we see actually that it's a number of partners, a little bit like the medieval Italy, where you had the small companies working together, but the Italian or the medieval Italian village has become the world, or the world has become a medieval Italian village, where people keep on working together. And then that raises a lot of questions about the fact that from a managerial point, and even from an economist point of view, this is a very good system and probably creates wealth for everybody, but it risks to be interfered with by politics. And that's where you, in a sense, pointed at the fact that China could become its own enemy, because if it doesn't have that good relationships with other countries, it cuts in its own industrial strength. And the third point that I do believe is interesting is that simply the fact that you see these 3 experiments ongoing in China, Pearl River Delta, Beijing, Shanghai that you referred to, which developed in a very different way. And obviously there is always this sort of administrative and industrial heritage that influences that, but that there is not one single way of being successful with innovation. And I think that's also important to realize that there are many different ways to actually create value and create true innovation and create growth, perhaps as a consequence, perhaps not as a consequence of it. But can I ask you to put your hands together to thank Dan for...
Thank you, Professor Breznitz, and thank you, Professor de Meyer. But please remain on stage, as now we would like to invite Professor de Meyer to present a token of appreciation to our speaker, Professor Breznitz. Professor de Meyer, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We'll have to take the position.
Thank you, Professor de Meyer. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of the lecture. Once again, we'd like to thank our distinguished guest speaker, Professor Breznitz, and all our guests for joining us this evening.